are both aware. And it's usually a couple seconds behind, so I'll give it a second for the streams to actually start, all the engines to rev up, the bits to start flowing.
Flux
And
capacitor.
yes, the flux capacitor. And there we go. All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to this very special HashiStack live stream. This is a live stream that I do monthly, and we have a special guest that will be joining us in a little bit. But before we do that, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Ned Bellavance, Ned in the Cloud, and I'm a HashiCorp ambassador, and I'm just excited to be here and talk to the excellent human beings who chose to join me and grace me with their presence. So let's start with one of those human beings. Rian, welcome to the live stream. Can you tell the folks a little bit about yourself and this really cool project that you have baking?
Good morning, Ned. Hi, John. Thanks for having me on your stream. I'm Rian Nolan. I created HashiCube, and it's a little Docker container using Vagrant to spin up all of the HashiCorp products, Vault, Consul, Waypoint, all of them. And it also has some nice integrations like Minikube and GitLab and AWX Tower, which you can then plug in. So it runs local, or if you look for HashiCube on the Terraform registry, then you can run it in AWS, GCP, or Azure, or all of them together. And yeah, super nice. It's quick for POC. In my personal capacity, I'm a consultant. I work for Versent in Australia. And I do Hashi stuff, and I help clients onboard onto the cloud.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for joining. And John, what about you? Welcome to the stream. Tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm also in Australia, and I also have a different accent. I'm a Canadian, so there you go. I'm a community director for a company called Octopus Deploy. You can find us at octopus.com. And prior to that, I was at Telerik, and prior to that, I was at Microsoft. We build a deployment solution for DevOps teams, and we integrate with a number of HashiCorp products. For a while, I was working on the Terraform provider that we have for Octopus Deploy. And yeah, that's just the brief smattering. Rian, I love the description of HashiCube being a small project. I was looking at it yesterday. It is not small.
It's a tiny little container.
Right, just a little one.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's funny, John. My very first DevOps project, if we want to call it that, this was like 2014, right? So,
Yep.
Early days, was working with Octopus Deploy and PowerShell's DSC. I don't know if you remember. Well, I mean, it still exists, right? But
yeah.
Early days in DSC.
Yes.
And it was my first infrastructure as code, defining your environments and automating the build process and all that.
Look where we've come so far, So,
I know,
yes.
right? But it's still, all the fundamentals still apply. I learned about the get, test, and set loop that DSC uses is basically what everything uses. And I transferred those skills to Terraform and Ansible and everywhere else. So
yes.
Thank you, I guess. We'll go with that.
Well done. Nice.
All right. Well, thank you both, gentlemen, for joining today. And before we bring Armon onto the stream, I just want to mention the community guidelines and code of conduct. We want this to be a productive and informative session for people to get some clarity around the recent licensing change in HashiCorp products. So if you're here to be friendly and be kind to others, that's awesome. If that's not your deal, well, there's other streams out there. Go find those. With that out of the way, I want to introduce someone who possibly needs no introduction. Armon Dadgar, you are the CTO and co-founder of HashiCorp. Welcome to the stream. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ned. Thanks for hosting.
Good morning.
Yeah, you bet. And when I was asked if I wanted to have Armon on the stream, I was like, is there any other answer than yes? Of course I do. And especially with the recent announcement with the changes in licensing for a bunch of HashiCorp products. So I guess the first big question I'd like to ask, and the one on everybody's mind, is what changed and why?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the, and what I'd also point people to, if they haven't yet seen it, is there was sort of the blog post, an updated blog post, which sort of clarified some FAQs, and then a fairly exhaustive set of FAQs as we've been getting feedback from the community. But I think that the short of it, is effectively the core 8 projects, right? So think Terraform, Vault, Console, et cetera, got relicensed from MPL to a business source license. moving forward for future releases. So it's not a retroactive, right? All the current stuff, everything that was previously MPL, still MPL. All of our libraries, all of our providers, all of our SDKs, all of our APIs, all that remains MPL. So it's really core 8 products, switches over to BSL. And I think the core of the BSL restriction, it's a very straightforward license. If you look at it, it's basically kind of boilerplate BSL, and there's like 2 sentences that actually matter. And the 2 sentences basically say, you can do whatever you want, except package it up to compete directly with HashiCorp. Right. And I think the motivation and the why, I mean, the sort of license ties directly into the motivation is that's exactly what we were seeing happen. Right. There was a fairly large, set of vendors who were starting to basically just take HashiCorp products, put a different sticker on top of it, and then sort of sell it as their own without contributing back in any meaningful way, to the community. And so I think, if you're sitting on the other side of that table, I think there's a very large group of people who have, thankfully reminded us that's the spirit of open source. And you're like, yeah, that's fair. I'm not arguing that's the spirit of open source. But as a rational vendor, you say, okay, I have 2 or 3 possible responses to that. One is I ignore it and I keep saying, let me, keep funding R&D on behalf of my competitors. Maybe not the most sane thing to do. 2, you say, I stop putting that IP in open source, and instead I'll just put it in our enterprise products or our cloud products. And so I'll stop putting innovation in the community, because that way my competitors can't just package up, the IP I'm spending, millions of dollars to develop. That's sort of, the next rational option would be don't put it in the community. And I think we didn't like that option internally. I think the challenge we had with that is we said, we've spent 10 plus years as an open source company where the vast majority of our innovation has been in the open. It feels shitty that our answer would be, great, just stop putting anything in the community, just put it in HCP or just put it in the enterprise versions. And so then we said, okay, is there a different path that lets us sort of trade off a little bit and say, okay, maybe it's not pure play open source, right? Because I don't think, BSL follows the definition of an OSI license, but it strikes that middle ground where it lets us say, I'm going to keep innovating in the open. I'm going to keep putting things in the community. I'm going to put, valuable IP out there for the community to use and share my source code broadly, as opposed to continuing to, maybe say, I'm just going to put it in the closed source versions. And so I think that's really, what motivated it is. Like, when you see that as a rational reaction, you're going to, most people would say, I'm going to stop arming my competitor. And I think, putting it in the open and making it source available and sharing it with the community, to us felt like it was the most aligned thing to our original ethos.
Gotcha. Well, I know some people saw licensing change. They immediately started freaking out because licensing change can mean a lot of different things. Rian, I want to ask you a quick question. Since you're a consultant and you work with HashiCorp products, what were some concerns that came up for you immediately when you saw the licensing change go into effect?
Well, for me, not personally, not really very much. I mean, it's a logical next step in the progression of HashiCorp as a company, right? It makes 100% total sense. There was some confusion for some of my colleagues. What does this mean? Whatever this. But after they read the FAQ, it was pretty straightforward. Like Armon has explained just now, there's literally only those 2 sentences. So even with HashiCube, I package all the Hashis, man. I smash it all together, and there's Jenkins in there and GitLab and all of this stuff. But I do not compete with them competitively. And, to that thought as well, we all pay taxes, man. Pay the emperor what they deserve, right? So Hashi is pretty cool in that respect, in that regard, because we run Terraform acceleration programs and Vault acceleration programs, and we deal also with licenses, and you guys have this flex model, right? People are able to negotiate with them. And I think that is partly such a positive thing. And this is where the real strength comes from. If vendors approach you and say, look, HashiCorp, we've used your tool and we built this. Let's make a deal, man. Let's sit together at the same table and do this for the greater good. I mean, you guys have given more than your competitors, I would argue, right? To the community as a large. So there wasn't really much confusion. I mean, it's pretty much straightforward,
Gotcha. So some of the questions that came up from other people that I work with and what I've heard from other practitioners were, how does this impact my use if I'm a consultant going and empowering other people using various HashiCorp technologies. If I'm, going out and working with folks and using Terraform to deploy their infrastructure, do I now have to get a commercial license from HashiCorp? Armon, can you clear up sort of what happens with consultants that are using the products today?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think this is probably one of the most common areas of maybe confusion that we got, and we got a lot of inbound questions from consultants and system integrators to sort of our licensing at email. And I think the answer is really clear. And we've updated the FAQ to make it even more clear, which is like, there is no impact, right? We have a huge ecosystem of system integrators we work with and consultants who provide professional services. And there's nothing in the BSL that would prevent that, right? And I think we want that, more than prevent it. It's like we actually are, we have an active ecosystem program where we encourage system integrators because that's actually a core part of making customers and users successful, right? Like, they need partners to come in, help them deploy it, help them manage it, help them actually adopt the tools. And so that's very much something we have always supported. We've always had an SI partner community, and it's something we continue to invest in. And so the license change doesn't really impact that at all. You can continue to use the community versions, continue to help customers deploy it, manage it, operate it, adopt it, right? Like that's sort of unimpacted.
Gotcha. Now there's the competitive offering side of things. And John, I know as running Octopus Deploy, you integrate some portions of the HashiCorp stack. Was that a concern for you that you would be considered a competitive offering?
Yeah, honestly, it's that term. We don't know. Are we considered competitive? Was the whole the question at hand. We were like, so because we are huge fans of HashiCorp. When it comes to the CI/CD space, obviously you get that concept of a pipeline of tools going through. And so, yeah, you're going to leverage CLIs along the way, especially when you're doing deployments, for example, like we do. And so it was one of those questions like, okay, not really quite sure. So I'm speaking just personally from that perspective. So that was my initial reaction there. So clarity around that for partners in particular, because we are a HashiCorp partner, would be awesome. I've suggested some possible ways in which we can make it work. But yeah, that was kind of the main concern there was like, look, we want to support whatever HashiCorp is doing relative to that because we're partners, but at the same time, it's like we're not really quite sure. We're kind of in the dark.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's always going to be some gray areas. I think that's why we said let's create a formal way of people can reach out to us. So that's why we had the licensing ad and our Discuss forum, so we kind of have those channels. And I think there's a lot of cases where it's like, even if it's gray, we want to enable partners to be successful. And so that's something we've put in our FAQs, where it's like we've put in a bunch of license agreements with joint partners where they're non-commercial. It's just like, hey, you might be in a gray area. Here's a one-page legal agreement that we can both sign. It just says, hey, yeah, we know what this use case is. You guys aren't in the gray. Great, let's go do this. And it's like the goal was not to create a whole bunch of friction or challenge for our ecosystem and especially our partners. It's like we want to make sure that they have the clarity of like, yeah, let's go do this stuff and integrate together. And our goal is to make that easy, right? And so that's what we've done is we have a bunch of folks that we've already gone and signed these agreements with to say, yeah, here's a one-pager meant to be simple. We don't need to have a team of lawyers on this stuff. It's just saying, here's the use cases. We understand it. We're making clear we don't believe that's competitive, and let's go invest in this together, right? And I think to your point, I think from a user perspective, if you're using a CI/CD tool, you're going to use, integrate the Vault command line. You're going to use Terraform. You're going to use whatever. That's okay. I mean, I think the view there is it's like it's a user who's using it internally. They're configuring a CI/CD tool to integrate with the HashiCorp products. That's an end user who's not selling a competitive solution directly against us, right? They're using Octopus as a CI/CD tool, right? Versus I think some other folks where it's, it's literally marketed as, hey, this is your Terraform cloud replacement, or this is your, Vault, enterprise replacement. I think, again, if it goes back to it's an end user configuring it for internal use, great. BSL says go for it.
Right. So one concern that came up from one of the YouTube viewers is what sort of guarantee is there that if they're currently using something that's open source today, would they have to start paying for it tomorrow? And I know that the question's a little vague on the different scenarios. So maybe we can go through a couple potential scenarios. So let's say I do have an offering that people pay for today, and HashiCorp does not have a competitive offering. Could you come out with a competitive offering and then start asking me to pay commercial licensing fees? Like, is that something I have to be concerned about now?
Yeah, I mean, another good question. I think this came up, and I honestly, for me, this was a little bit of a shame on us for not sort of anticipating this FAQ before we went out. And I think in hindsight, we probably should have seen this question. I think it was one of the first things we clarified in our FAQ, right, is what we added to it as we said, hey, if you build a product and then in the future that becomes competitive because who knows, HashiCorp buys a company or we add a feature or whatever it is, that no, your use case is sort of grandfathered in, right? And again, I think the intent behind this change was not meant to be offensive, right? Like it's not like HashiCorp suddenly a patent troll or whatever, and we're like going out there and trying to like, find ways to be a nightmare. It was very much defensive. It's like you have companies who are sort of basically saying, hey, I'll take free R&D, plug it into my distribution channel, charge 20 cents on the dollar, and that's 20 free cents. I'm not doing any work to generate it. So that was really the effort. The goal was really not to like make this an offensive mechanism. And so we added a bunch of that clarity to our FAQ, which is like, yeah, if we enter your market and we become competitive because of, whatever, then great. Your use cases sort of continues to get grandfathered forever, right? If you want to even use our products to cross compete, that's also okay. So if you're using Terraform to build your new Vault competitor, great, knock yourself out. If you're using Vault behind the scenes for your new Terraform competitor, great, right? Even the cross compete we're saying is fine. Right. So I think the goal was very much to say, hey, you can't just package up Vault, call it, my cool secret store and sell that against us. It was not meant to be sort of this license, massive overreach or to make it into sort of an aggressive sort of a tool that we're using to pursue people.
Right. I think that's an important point to maybe say again in my own words is if you're building a Vault competitor, not using the Vault bits, but building a secrets manager competitor to Vault, and you're using Terraform under the covers to build out your infrastructure, you don't have to pay a licensing fee to HashiCorp to use Terraform to deploy your infrastructure.
Right.
Okay. So that definitely lends a lot of clarity in terms of sort of the commercial side of things. Trying to think of some other interesting scenarios. Rian, John, do you have any scenarios that you were wondering about?
It's more of an observation than anything. It's just the fact that when you're dealing with tooling, I'm a software developer at heart, basically, and that's where as soon as you start putting licensing and terms like that, developers immediately go like this. So I think that was the initial reaction, if just anecdotally from my perspective. So more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I think in some sense we felt like some of that is I think unavoidable, and I think we saw that with Elastic, we saw that with Mongo, we saw that with Confluent and everybody else who I think kind of went through that process ahead of us. My sense is though it feels like I think increasingly this will become the new normal. I think the challenge otherwise that sits at the heart of open source is you always have this challenge of, as a startup, if I create this innovative thing, what stops a vendor that has massive distribution from just plucking it up and saying, great, I drop it into my channel and I'll go monetize this, right? And so to me, it's sort of not surprising that you've seen almost every major open source project kind of go down that path, right? And I think even if I look at a project that's massively successful like Kubernetes, what I'd point to is like, well, who actually makes money on Kubernetes? Was it the million startups that sort of started that ecosystem, or was it the 5 people who were massive before Kubernetes existed? Right. And so I think when you kind of look at that, it's sort of not surprising, right? Which is, I think that the forever truism has always been a startup's challenge is to find distribution faster than an incumbent copies your innovation. And I think that the heart of open source means that the cost of copying the innovation is 0. So I think it creates this very interesting dilemma. And I think that's what sort of pushes a bunch of vendors down this path over time.
And it's quite funny that you even have licenses like the Creative Commons, where you can share something for free, but you need a license to do that, and it's probably the first commercial licenses that gave birth to this. Well, now the free stuff need licenses too, and I mean, as with everything, I think the license space, like you said, is just still busy evolving. Like the tools, like the DevOps, like everything else is busy evolving. The licensing is also going through this evolution.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think some of that is just going to be, I think what's easy and what's been nice about open source licenses is they're very understandable. Like, great, I know MIT, I can do whatever I want with it. I don't have to think about it. And so I think you're right, John, which is these, as these additional license sort of types get introduced that aren't sort of pure play OSI open source, they do force a little bit more awareness on behalf of developers. But I think that's the trade-off, right? Like, I think if you want companies like Mongo to build great full-featured databases in the open, you might have to read the Mongo thing that says, okay, I can't build a competitor to Mongo using Mongo. And I think that's, to me, that feels like a better scenario for us to be in versus saying this innovation is all SaaS and it's all closed source and you don't have access to it.
Right. when I was thinking through the licensing and the implications, things like Vault and Console are intended to be run as a service, right? You literally launch them as a server. You do Vault server when you're running it from the command line, or Console server, and you stand it up. So in that way, it made sense to me immediately. Okay, yeah, if you want to run Console as a service for somebody else and offer it as a commercial offering, that's definitely competitive, right? Terraform's a little funkier because you don't really run it as a service. It's a tool to deploy infrastructure. So how does the licensing encompass something like Terraform that's not run as a service, but you can put some, I guess, window dressing around it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the hosting becomes like a little bit more obvious, maybe, I think, with like to your point, like a long running server, because it's because you're literally just running it. I guess Terraform, I think about is like, it's pretty similar in the sense that it's like, you can still host Terraform in the case of, if I'm pushing the button and Terraform is, being executed on my behalf, then it's like, you're effectively, it's the same thing as kind of bringing Vault on demand to service that request and shutting Vault down. So it kind of looks similar in that sense.
Okay, so that would be in the licensing. I think there was a term that said embedded or hosted. So Terraform would be more of the embedded use
Exactly.
case.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think we put a lot more clarity into that, in the FAQ of like exactly how we're defining embedded to make it a little bit more obvious. But I think you're right. Terraform tends to look a little bit more embedded, where Vault Console Nomad might look a little bit more literally hosted.
Okay. Okay. Now, I know the community has reacted with some strong voices in both directions, and I think most of the Sturm and Drang has been over Terraform in particular. So, how has the reaction been that you've seen on the community, and what are your thoughts on some of the efforts out there regarding Terraform?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of I'd almost break the reaction to, maybe I'll call it like, 3 camps, by and large. Right. I think camp 1 is, I'd say, the vast majority of users who seem to read it and go, yeah, A, makes sense, B, doesn't impact me. It's kind of business as usual. Right. And I think that's sort of the majority, and probably the silent majority. They're sort of like, seems great. I think maybe the second category is, which is probably, the noisiest, I'd call it, is the direct competitors, frankly. And I think we see a whole lot of, active efforts to spread what's, I think pretty clearly FUD, right? I mean, things that's like, okay, if you even did a cursory skim of the FAQ, you would see that sort of unfounded. So I think that's sort of the second category. And then the third category is, I think, folks that are maybe a bit more, I think had a bit more open source, kind of philosophical view of it, which I get. And I think, well, one of the things we were trying to be really clear with HashiCorp is like, we're not calling what we're doing open source. Right. And I think we were very clear on that. We're not trying to kind of open wash it and call it open source. Like, we're very clear. It doesn't meet the OSI definition of open source. The source is open. It is freely available. You're, have broad rights to download it, fork it, modify it, redistribute it. But it doesn't meet the specific technical definition of OSI. Right. So, I think that's maybe how I broadly categorize, it feels like the kind of 3 camps. And sort of the 3 reactions, and I think probably unsurprising for us.
Okay. Anton just asked a question, and we know Anton. We like Anton. I'm trying to parse his question and figure out what he's asking. So, what should happen for HashiCorp to make license exceptions for Terraform while keeping the rest service-like production? So, is there a chance in the future that you're going to make a licensing change just for Terraform, or we're pretty locked into BSL across all 8 products at this point, right?
Yeah, I don't think we'd make any changes to licensing. And I think there was a previous question too about sort of like, evolutions of it. I think, one of these tend to be changes that you want to be very thoughtful about. Obviously, right? We don't want to roll these out sort of haphazardly on sort of a whim. So I think we spent a bunch of time thinking about this stuff. And again, I think for us, it's really thinking about what would it take for us to think about sustainably investing in community innovation on the long term, right? And so if I go back to that and say, okay, does it make sense for me to spend tens of millions of dollars in R&D to then immediately give it to a competitor who sells it back at 20 cents on the dollar without carrying any of the R&D cost? no, just it doesn't make sense, right? Like it's hard for me to defend that as a reasonable thing for me to do. And so then practically speaking, my alternatives are really only a few things, which is one, go down a path that's somewhat indefensible for me to say, yeah, I do free R&D for my competitors. That's option one. Option two is I say, I don't put the innovation in the community product. Great. That's a practical option. I can put it in Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise or Vault Enterprise or whatever. That's option two. Or option three is you say, I'm going to strike a middle ground. I want to put that innovation in the community. I want it to be open. I want the source to be available, right? But I need to put some reasonable commercial protection that someone doesn't sell it back against me, right? And so to me, I think those are your three rational choices, right? Those are the three doors to walk through, right? And I think our view was, this was the best door because it lets us put that innovation in the open and continue to do that. I think the other option isn't go back to option one, which is keep doing it in the open and give it to your competitors to sell against. Like, it's just not a sensible option.
Right. So I'm curious, I know how the licensing works for like Vault or console. If you want to get the enterprise version or you want to purchase it through HCP, right? If there is someone who's building a competitive service for like Terraform Cloud and they do want to go down the avenue of doing a commercial license with HashiCorp, I mean, you don't have to tell me exactly what the model would be, but how would someone go about getting that license for Terraform to build that competitive offering?
Yeah, and so what we've said in the FAQ is reach out to us, licensing at, we're happy to have the conversation. I think at a high level, the way we're thinking about it to make it sort of fair across our broader ecosystem is we treat it almost like a reseller arrangement, right? So in the same way, you can sign up today and say, hey, I want to be a reseller of HashiCorp. I'm providing services. I want to also resell the HashiCorp products. We have a formal reseller program for that, and we work with many resellers around the world. And even there, we have a well thought out way of managing, because ultimately, if you think about a reseller, there's a level of compete, right? The reseller might be selling against the HashiCorp rep who's talking to the same customer. And so we have ways you manage that channel conflict. You say, hey, great, we'll give you a discount, but there's a limit to the discount so that you're not pricing us down on the product that you're reselling on us. But there's a shared price list, there's a discount table, there's a resell agreement, and we have a process for how we manage channel conflicts. And I think we would look at it through the same lens, which is like, great, if you want to be a resale partner and build a product and add additional capabilities, right? Great. We will treat you the same way. We have a broad community of SIs and resellers that we work with. We have a formal program for it.
Right. I worked for a reseller for a good long amount of time, reselling hardware primarily. But yeah, we were called value-added resellers because the idea was, yes, we're reselling the product and you could go direct to the vendor, but we're adding some sort of additional value on top of it, whether it's how we're managing, delivering services, integrating things. And because of that, there's a markup that we apply, and we're, blessed by the vendor to resell that product. So that makes a lot of sense.
And I think that leads to a win-win scenario, right? You're truly adding value. The company behind that's sort of building the product that you're building your innovation on top of is also, participating with you. And then it becomes a win-win, right? I think you got to create value on top. The partner gets to participate, and the end customer gets sort of a better product, right? And so that's kind of what we want to enable.
Right. It's definitely, you mentioned the approach of enterprise. What do you put in the enterprise product versus what goes in the community version? And I know that's always been a balancing act with anything that's been sort of in the open core landscape is, what do we include in the open source and or the community version, and what goes into the paid version? Is anything going to change in that calculus now that you've changed the licensing for the core products?
It actually helps us move more things out of the enterprise product, frankly, because I think this dynamic has existed for a while where I think we've had to look at it and say, like, hey, some of this next, new features that we want to introduce, and actually we have a bunch of cool stuff we're going to announce at HashiConf in, a little over a month here. I think we had to have that debate internally, which is like, hey, are you going to put that in the community edition? And like day zero, you've done a bunch of work that you're enabling your competitor with, right? Or do you say maybe it's only in Terraform Cloud or it's only in Terraform Enterprise? So I think now it's actually freed us to go back to our original goal, which is like, I want to be able to put that in the community product. And the licensing change now lets us do that, right? And I think that was the whole point of this.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, we got a question from YouTube chat asking about licensing implications for Terraform automation tools. And I think they're thinking about like sort of the open source automation tools that are out there. They mentioned Atlantis, which I believe is an open source. And there are some other open source efforts out there to do automation of Terraform or, use GitHub Actions, something like that. So does this licensing impact those open source projects?
So Atlantis specifically, is a HashiCorp project, and no, we haven't changed that. It's still Mozilla public license. Nothing changes there. And then I think we added to our FAQ to make this super clear, which is, I think there's actually two different ones. One specifically on open source projects where we say, again, no, feel free, embed it, incorporate it. And I think the key clause is, how do we think about a competitive offering? And a competitive offering one is that's either, it's sold, it's a paid for product that you're selling, or it's one that is commercially supported, right? You're either direct or indirect commercial support for it. If you're creating an open source project around Terraform like Atlantis, and it's just, here's a project, community's welcome to use it, and it's a community effort, then yeah, that's great. And we encourage that, and there's a lot of tools in the ecosystem like that.
I think it's that definition of competition. I'm a Canadian, so I'm going to use an analogy, which is if you're skating too close to the thin ice, what is a competitor in HashiCorp's definition is I guess where I was thinking.
Yeah, I think to us it's really, I think there's obviously and I think you're right. There's a gray area where it's like it's hard to exactly legally define it, especially when you think about the range of products we have. And so I think, one option was like, hey, do you create a specific BSL license for each product that specifically defines, here's the traits. We didn't want to go down that path because then you end up with 9, 10 different BSL licenses basically with different terms, and it becomes kind of a mess. So I think our view was like, okay, in those gray areas, that's where it's like, let's just make it easy by having the escape hatch, which is email us, let's have a conversation, let's have a one-page license agreement, and we call it a day. I think in general for us, it's really a look at, if it's marketed as directly, hey, this is a Terraform cloud replacement, that's pretty straightforward. It's like, you've told us it's competitive, right? Like, we don't need to do a whole lot of research, right? I think two is, it's like, is there a significant feature overlap with the commercial products, right? Or is it, hey, it incidentally might be able to do some of the same things, but it's not really, that's not what the product is marketed for or what it's designed to do. And three is like, is the product's core value prop really derived from the HashiCorp products, right? Meaning, great, if I'm putting Terraform in my Jenkins pipeline, Jenkins value isn't primarily derived from Terraform, right? It can run Terraform, it can run a billion other things, right? And so I think there's a few kind of guidelines like that we use to sort of think about it, right? But I think, ultimately that's where we said, yeah, there's always going to be sort of gray areas, and there's going to be cases where it's like, great, just email us and let's have the conversation.
I love the fact how you guys kind of, just from my personal view, how you almost with this licensing thing stay true to your Tao. I've always believed, from the very beginning and Vagrant and all the products you put out was very much community focused. And this licensing thing, sticks close to your Tao. And I just wanted to say that's nice,
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think we've gotten yeah, I think a lot of the community, some, vocal minority views it as sort of an abandoning of sort of maybe the ethos. And I think for me, it's sort of the opposite, which is like, no, if I wanted to abandon the ethos, I'd just say put every new feature in closed source.
Yes.
That's abandoning the ethos, right? Like, this is us trying to preserve the ethos, given sort of.
That's beautiful, man.
Yeah, there are definitely some features that exist in Enterprise Vault that I would love to see make it out to the open source version as well, or the community version as well, because I think they're awesome and I want more people to experience them. But I understand that there's a pricing model there. You're a company, you are ostensibly there to make some amount of money, and the way to do that is to have an enterprise version or to charge for services or something along those lines. So I'm actually, I hadn't thought about it before, but now that you're mentioning this opens the door to add more features to the community editions, I'm like, oh, okay.
And on what you just said, it's a natural progression where you can host your own mail server, but would you in this day and age? You can run your own Git server, but why would you? People use GitHub, or GitLab and stuff like that. So in the same sense as well, if people build this massive enterprise companies using open source, I would argue that you're actually putting yourself at risk. Yes, you can host your state file in S3, but now you need to make sure that it's protected and backed up and versioned and all of this, with Terraform Cloud just abstracts this thing from you, right? So there's that growth aspect to it as well.
Yeah.
I think one concern that I've heard from a few people is there are a lot of interesting features in the other sort of Terraform Cloud competitors. And the concern is that this is a move to sort of extinguish or squash those other competitors, which will lead to a less overall, good products. I'm searching for words here. The quality of the products will not improve as quickly because there'll be less competition in the marketplace. So do you think that's a likely outcome, or are you going to be dedicating even more resources to Terraform Cloud to make it better?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't share that as a concern on our side. I mean, I don't think we view this as a, hey, now we can just chill and not think about product innovation. Just so to me, I think that's never been the ethos of the company. I don't think we've ever sort of rested on our laurels, right? I think from very beginning, we've continued to innovate, I think, across both the community editions of the products as well as the enterprise editions. We've, focused then on bringing out cloud versions. And, to your point, I think people don't want to manage some of this stuff. So I think we've always looked at how do we continue to push the bar? How do we spend time with our customers to really drive forward the future of the products and be strong stewards of them? And, I hear the point on, I think competition always, drives innovation. I think in practice, what we've seen with a lot of our competition is it's not driving innovation. It's, putting a sticker or copycatting exactly what we've done and sort of selling it at a discount. So I think I don't think we've seen a lot of, hey, this is way out ahead of where we are. And it's really a driver of innovation. I think we've always been intrinsically motivated to do that. And I think, again, we have a very important reason to do it, which is we have customers who give us the feedback. We have community users who give us the feedback. And I think that continues to drive and motivate us to push the products and make them better. Right? And I know we hear that from customers as well, which is like, hey, these are the feature gaps. Here's the usability things. Here's like improvements we'd like to see. And we're constantly investing in solving those things.
Well, hopefully this change will have some more revenue flowed in, which can support some more FTEs who can then work on the projects and make them even better than they already were. At least that's in my mind, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, for me, this is not about, it's not about driving short-term revenue. So it's like, that was not the motivation. It's really about thinking about what's the long-term model here and how do we make sure we can continue to sort of innovate in the open.
Right. There have been some concerns from people who are in the CNCF about the way that they're fairly strict about the licensing of dependencies in their projects. Have you been in contact with any of the folks that are on the CNCF to talk about this licensing change and how it impacts some of their projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think HashiCorp's a member of the CNCF. We have been for many years, right? And so we participate in a lot of the different sort of committees and things like that. So again, I think there has been some confusion. I think some people, I think the first level initial interpretation was that we've relicensed everything in the HashiCorp universe to BSL, which is not true. It's really just the 8 core products. Like, we still have hundreds of providers, libraries, APIs, SDKs, and I think a lot of those things are pretty prolifically used in the Go ecosystem. Right, lots of different libraries, from everything from error handling to CLIs to data structures and things like that, and all of those remain MPL. And so by and large, we did look at what are all the CNCF dependencies that get pulled in. I believe all of them remain Mozilla public license. So it's really not an impact to any of the CNCF. And I think even more broadly outside of the CNCF, our goal was, again, we have a huge ecosystem of people who use a lot of the Go libraries and modules and things that we maintain. And our goal was not to disrupt any of that.
That's why I was working on another open source project not that long ago, and I was looking through the Go modules, and I kept seeing like HashiCorp stuff, and I'm like, this isn't using any HashiCorp. Oh, I guess it is. But right, it wasn't one of those. Wasn't one of the core 8 products. It was one of those other open source tools that just seems to be a Go module people find really useful.
There are many of them, believe me.
Yeah,
I'm not a developer. I don't even pretend to be a developer, but every once in a while, and I find myself in Go code, and I'm like, "Ooh, look, familiar names." Now I feel a little more comfortable. Okay. So, I guess, what other concerns have you heard, or what are other things that you want people in the community to know about the licensing change and just kind of the future of HashiCorp, whatever you can publicly talk about?
Sure. I mean, I'm trying to think about what were the areas of confusion, because I think those were probably the most interesting. And I think broadly, I'd maybe bucket into like I think there was kind of like 4 categories of things that we kind of saw over and over again, which was like, does this change my ability to use the products for my internal use? And I think the answer is no. Right? It doesn't. If you're using Terraform, Vault, Console, Boundary, whatever, internally for your organization to power your production environments, and it's not part of a competitive product, the answer is no. Keep using it, no impact. I think there was a bunch of questions on the competitive side, and I think John raised some of the things, and I think Ned, you raised some of the things of like, what about a future competition? What about a cross-product competition? What about some of these gray areas? And so I think that's where we spent a bunch of time trying to clarify that this is pretty narrow. If we compete with you in the future, it's fine. If you want to cross-compete, it's fine. If there's really a question, great, let's clarify it. And we have non-commercial licensing terms to make sure you feel comfortable, and then to provide more crisp definition on sort of how we think about that. I think open source, you already raised it, was another area. People think it doesn't impact your libraries. What about your SDKs? What about all these other things? Can I mix, your the code with different code bases that have different licenses? So I think we've clarified that, yeah, all the pretty much outside of the few products, everything else is unimpacted. It's MPL. Even the ones that are BSL, you actually can mix those with other licenses. So if you have a open source project that uses Vault, and that's an Apache project or something, the BSL is compatible with most of those licenses, right? I think some of the GPL licenses are not compatible, but Apache, MPL, things like that are. So I think that was the other way. And then I think we talked about it at the very beginning, which was the professional services, which was like, does it impact the ability to do consulting or professional services? And the answer is no, right? So I think those are probably the 4 areas of biggest confusion I think that we saw sort of repeatedly. I think the other thing from us would be, again, I think the alternative was going to be, it was not more open source. The alternative was more closed source. And so I think for us, this was really finding that middle ground to tread and say, like, we want to continue to invest in open community innovation. And we felt this was the best path to do it.
Speaking of open, I am just getting across this news, and so I've just read the blog post from the OpenTF announcement regarding their fork. So, it's 4 a.m. here in Australia. I can only do so much, but as they're going through this, the interesting challenge here is obviously when decisions like this are made, obviously you see, sort of maybe a splintering. And so OpenTF is now a result of this. And so it begs the question, now what, right? So, what thoughts on OpenTF? What is the long game here, to your point, thinking about the long game? What is the long game relative to that? And any thoughts or opinions on that?
Yeah, I'm kind of in your boat too. I've been in meetings for the last few hours, so I'm playing catch up as well. Thankfully, it is not 4 a.m. for me, so thank you for the early wake up. I think at a high level, the nice thing about BSL, the nice thing about MPL is it's always entitled people to do a fork, right? So I think everyone is well within their right to do that if they feel strongly that the licensing has that much of an impact on them. I think the reality is these projects are a whole lot of work to build and maintain and deliver. And I think when you look at the reality of the contributions to things like Terraform Core, Vault Core, Console Core, more than 95+% of the contributions have been HashiCorp. So, that's not to discount the community. The community plays an important and enormous role in the ecosystem and the integration surface. So Terraform has 3,500 providers as an example. And a lot of those are community driven, or they're driven through ISV partners. But when you really look at the heavy lift of the cores of Vault, the cores of Terraform, driving forward HCL, that's been HashiCorp, right? And I think it's going to continue to be HashiCorp. So, I think there's a huge discount to how much work goes into some of that stuff. I think it's easy to push a fork button. It's much harder to build a community, to be a steward, to drive this forward and bring a whole ecosystem with you. And I think that's something we've spent 10+ years doing. And I think the vast majority of our community is going to look at it and say, HashiCorp's been a great steward. They're going to continue to be a great steward. And this really doesn't impact my ability to use it. And that's kind of our view.
Yeah, the feeling I have just as a practitioner, if I'm thinking about provisioning infrastructure via Terraform, the things I care about the most are like my HCL files, my state files, etc. And the tool is like, okay, let's compete on tool then. That's fine. But I think that's part of the visceral reaction you get from especially practitioners like myself, where it's like, okay, what does this mean? And maybe an evolution of that. I'm just speculating, but maybe an evolution of that is keeping some of the parts and pieces continue to be open relative to that. Now, I know that the BCL is to the core 8, etc., but I can understand and sympathize with that sentiment.
Yeah, I get that. And I think my senses on these things is like what you generally see is, we're going to continue to innovate on Terraform and push it forward. And, I have a bunch of good stuff planned for HashiConf. And, my sense is we're going to continue to, push the community and the ecosystem forward on that side.
I know you said that 95% of the commits or 95% of the contributions came from internal HashiCorp people. Do you foresee a movement to engage more actively with community contributions going forward? Or do you think it's going to stay the core group of FTEs at HashiCorp making the updates and changes to Terraform?
I think it's never been for lack of wanting to engage with the community. I think the reality is these are very complex code bases, right? Like a Terraform provider by definition is meant to be very simple. We have simple SDKs. You can write 100 lines of Go code and integrate it with another thing. The Terraform core
is so hard though sometimes. Sorry to interrupt, but providers can be really hard to write. I'm sorry, I'm having a flashback. Sorry, continue.
Certainly, yeah, don't want to discount it, but I think the bar for a provider is pretty low. If you say, what's the bar for a contribution to Vault Core or contribution to Terraform core? You have to understand a super complicated code base that's doing, graphs and dependency management and parsing and managing plans and, being able to do, handle all sorts of complex failure cases. That all of that is hidden from you, from a user perspective. But as an internal contributor to it, you have to kind of deal with the guts of it, right? If you're dealing with, console and Vault, you're dealing with complex distributed systems and distributed consensus and, replication, and they're non-trivial code bases. And so the reality is, even for a HashiCorp employee, it takes months to get them ramped up and productive in these code bases because they're complicated. So it's hard to be like super weekend warrior and say, I'm just going to kind of like hack on this little feature on a code base that takes months to get familiar with, right? Like, it's not a knock. It's just, it is what it is. They're complicated code bases. So, I'm not saying we often do engage with the community. We do have contributors who are on the outside who are very motivated and do contribute things, and certainly we accept them. But I think what's hard is oftentimes you get people who aren't seeped in the complexity of it, and they're like, oh, I can just add this feature, but don't understand the second order or third order consequences because they don't work in that code base. And so it's like, okay, yeah, you added it, but you only solved this one use case. You kind of ignored these 5 other edge cases. And so it's like, yes, for us to then accept that, like now you've created this enormous burden for us to go solve those 5 edge cases that the PR didn't solve. So I think there's a lot of that kind of challenge, that I think exists. So again, when we get great community contributions that solve, like, here's a clear bug fix that fixes the thing, great. Here's a great feature that slots right in and it's well tested and all of that. Awesome. I think the challenge is there's not a lot of people who are fully ramped to be able to do that in a way that, comes into the project and is sort of ready to go. It's sort of,
right.
Some of the contributions can be like free as in a sick puppy.
As in a sick puppy. Oh, that's important.
Where you're like, okay, great. Not only do I have the puppy, now I have to nurse this thing back to health.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And the more I work with Terraform and Vault, the more I realize the level of complexity that's going on underneath to handle weird things that people do. Because if you want to see how creative people can be, give them a product and let them try to use it without a manual, and they'll just do weird stuff. And so, yeah, you got to solve for that and be ready for when they come with these strange use cases and be able to deal with it in a graceful way. And I know that I'm not a programmer, and this is probably part of why, is because I just throw my hands up at a certain point. I'm like, didn't you read the manual? No, I never read the manual.
That's especially true around all the Go libraries that HashiCorp has built. There is a lot there, and some of the projects unfortunately have collected a little bit of dust. And that's fine. That's to be expected. I mean, that's you have that relative to open source, but certainly I think that anything that involves like open source is there's going to be some edges of it where developers care a great deal, and yeah, just more of an observation than anything. The Go libraries that are available there's a lot. There is a ton. And yeah.
And I think they'll continue to be, right? I mean, I think that's, again, for us, I think an important part of the ethos. And, we've always believed in open source, and we still build new products in open source. And we're going to be careful not to call the new things, the projects under BSL that, but there's a lot of stuff HashiCorp does that is open source, that is MPL, and will continue to be.
It's funny, you can almost walk the entire history just by going through GitHub commits and all that. You can actually see, you do the retrospective archaeological dig of how Terraform came to be just by looking at the Go code.
So let's round this out with some forward-looking stuff, because HashiConf Global is coming up. I assume there's going to be some announcements, and I'm sure some of those you want to keep close to your chest for the moment. But is there anything you can tell us to expect or look forward to as HashiConf Global comes up?
You ruin all the surprise. No, I can't show the announcements in advance. That would defeat the whole point.
I have to try, right?
What am I getting for Christmas? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. No, there's I mean, lots of good announcements, and I think the keynotes will really cover sort of a whole broad range of the products. So I think expect a bunch of things across sort of the whole portfolio. So lots of good announcements, and but you have to stay tuned, unfortunately.
Oh man, see, I was going to get a little entree into the secret world of HashiConf, but no, I guess I got to just learn it with everybody else when I get there.
Can I ask a question? When will Sentinel get its own little logo? Hey, it's such a great little project. This open policy, well, not open, but policy and code. And I've always wondered, like, what would Sentinel's logo look like?
Oh, Sentinel's logo. You know, it's
Yeah.
funny. We went back and forth on like, should it actually have a logo for a long time? And we had some like mock-ups. It was sort of like it's kind of like an abstract robot is maybe the way I would describe the concepts that we had for it. But then in the end, we were like, will this be confusing to people? Because they'll think the products for us that actually have a logo are products. Versus Sentinel, it's like it's closer to a library because it sort of like doesn't on its own doesn't really do anything. It has to be like embedded within a tool to really make sense. So we were like, it'd be weird if it had a logo because it's more of a feature than a product. So we ended up not labeling it as such. But I think it would have been probably sort of an abstract robot type thing.
I see, maybe a shadow of something. It's not a real thing. It's just a shadow there in the corner, you know. But such a cool little tool, you know.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah, I like the syntax of Sentinel is, for me at least, a lot easier to read than writing Rego. I mean, I use both, but for whatever reason, I'm able to read the Sentinel stuff and write it a little bit easier. Is there any thought towards sort of releasing Sentinel under BSL licensing?
I think it's under MPL already.
Is it? Okay. I wasn't sure. I just know it comes with all the enterprise products, but I wasn't sure what the actual licensing was for Sentinel itself.
I'm pretty sure the core engine is just a standalone library, and then the integrations are part of the enterprise products. But the language spec has been open forever, and I'm pretty sure the engine as well. And I think I take your point on the Rego stuff. I mean, to me, it's like, in some sense, if I take one step higher level, it's like the thing we've always been trying to help users with is the concept of policy as code. I don't think we've ever cared too strongly about like the actual language itself, right? Like I think obviously we feel strongly about Sentinel. There's a reason we created it. But I think with things like Terraform, we've added support for OPA as well. So if you want to write your policy in OPA and Rego, great. If you want to add your policy in Sentinel language, great. I personally like the Sentinel language because it's modeled after Python, and Python's probably my favorite, syntax and programming language. Versus I think Rego tends to be modeled off of Prolog, which I haven't met a lot of Prolog fans, but I'm sure there's some out there.
There's got to be some. I don't know. I just like I can read it, but when I have to write it, I go to ChatGPT and I'm like, write me something in Rego that does this, and it's usually close enough that I can like bang it into shape, but it does not flow from me. But Python, I was actually hacking away on something for Vault and Python today, and It's easy.
Yeah, that was our goal. So it's funny because the origin of Sentinel, actually, so this is kind of a funny side story, is we were working with a large bank who's a customer, and their goal was, hey, we want to enable our compliance team to write policy, but they don't know how to code. And so that was actually some of the origin story of it, is like, okay, so how do you write a programming language? That's effectively what it is. But for someone who doesn't know what a programming language is. So if you look at a lot of the syntax in Sentinel, what we tried to do is actually help them translate what was literally, they had Word documents that were their policy that was like, if you have an S3 bucket, then it must be marked private in literally a Word document. And so if you look at like the syntax of Sentinel, it has things like a first class concept of like a rule, so that you can almost do that literal translation of I define a rule, and it's literally like, if resource is bucket, then this must be true. So that you could be a very non-technical user and still like write Sentinel policy and read it and have it almost, the Sentinel policy looks the same as the Word document. There's a little bit more like, parentheses. But it almost reads the same as a Word doc. And that was very much by intention. The goal was like, we want non-developers to be able to like read and write these policies.
Wow, I didn't know that story. That's cool. All right, well, we are coming to the top of the hour. I want to take this opportunity to let my other two fellow ambassadors once again plug their stuff. So, Rian, if folks want to hear more from you, where can they find you, and where can they find your HashiCube project?
Oh, thank you, man. It was great to be on your show. Well, they can find me on LinkedIn, Rian Nolan, or they can just go to HashiCube.com and clone it and Vagrant up. You know, it's incredible to run Vagrant up, and you have Waypoint in Nomad sitting alongside Waypoint deploying into Minikube. Everything in a Docker container. So it's a cute little tool. It enables me to bang out
not little.
Proof of concept.
Sorry, you keep saying little. Why are you using this moniker? Describe this massive cube.
It's a tiny little container, you know, but it's
all right.
so fun, so much fun, you know. And Armon, it's so great to meet you. And John, thank you so very much, man. 4 a.m., I'm going to watch the Springboks play the All Blacks now. They've already started playing 4:30 in the morning. And so it's been so much fun. Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rian. And John, what about you?
Yeah, just Google my name, whatever. Yeah, you can check us out at octopus.com. Hey, look, I'm a grizzled veteran now. You know, just use Google for what it's worth. Yeah, just check us out at octopus.com. CI/CD tool for deployments.
Yeah. Big fan of Octopus myself, so definitely worth checking out. And Armon, any last thoughts that you'd like the community to hear before we sign off?
Well, first of all, just to thank you for hosting, and thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, last words for the community would really be like, our goal was really to make this not disruptive. I know obviously it's going to be some level of people have to kind of, you know, understand what the license change means and the implications of that. But, you know, our goal at the end of the day was we want to preserve the use cases, allow end users to do their thing, allow our partners and consulting partners to keep doing their thing. And at the end of the day, it's like we want to keep investing in community innovation. And, you know, that's really the goal here. So, you know, I think, obviously, I think we learned some lessons along the way, and hopefully we were able to clarify some of that and sort of updated FAQs in the new blog post. But, you know, looking forward to HashiConf and a lot of good stuff to come.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll tell you, no matter what you plan, it never survives first contact with reality. So I think you guys have handled things very gracefully since the initial announcement. So thank you for updating the FAQs and bringing some clarity to the initial licensing. That's been very much appreciated. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you want to find me, you can find me, nedinthecloud.com. Till next time, keep calm and terraform on. I'll talk to everyone later. Bye.
Cheers, guys. Cheers, Ned. Bye.